Well, today we move on to the third form of the metaphysics of storytelling. That is the contribution of a man named Mircea Eliade, or probably more properly something like Mircea Eliade in Romanian. Eliade was a pioneer in the history of religions, and his specialty were Asian religions. And his great studies were in cyclical myths, as there is in Hinduism, and also a classic study in yoga and a very classic study in shamanism and from Siberia, North Asia. And his themes are that of creation and chaos, and the sacred and the profane. These are probably his two most important contributions to mythology and therefore to storytelling. We're not going to deal so much with sacred and profane today, but his sense was that in original religious experience, which is where all stories came from originally, in that religious experience of primitive people, if you want to use that category, uh, all experience that is ultimately real and valid is sacred experience. The deeds of the gods, the process of creation, and if you wanted to use Christian terminology, you'd speak about things like redemption, resurrection, etc. But you could do this with any religion, and the emphasis is that it is the sacred stories and myths that give meaning to the profane of everyday life. In other words, we don't really have the tools to interpret the significance of our everyday life and what we need to do in living it unless we have reference to the great myths. But I'm going to put that aside now because what's important for our discussion is his other idea, one of his many ideas, but his idea of the very importance of chaos and creation. So the first thing I have to do is contrast this with the work that Claude Lévi-Strauss did. Claude Lévi-Strauss was interested in opposites and in resolving the tension between opposites with a synthesis. This is not the same as we might imagine, the tension between chaos and creation. Rather, there's a different focus here, and the focus is that the chaos is one of confusion. It's not an equal in the structural mythology of Claude Lévi-Strauss. So, light and dark, female and male, winter and summer, and all the polarities are in contact and in contrast with each other. They supplement or they oppose each other. For Mircea Eliade, chaos is nothingness. It is emptiness. It is the stuff before the breath of life creates something. It is the silence before the first music, the first note, the first song is sung, as it is in the mythology of the Kalevala, of the Finnish people. The world is sung into existence. So this is a very rich topic. And what I want to suggest for our purposes is that when you tell a story to a listener, whether it be a formal myth or a personal story or whatever, you have a metaphysical choice on how you're going to handle the materials. And I'm going to summarize all of that later on. One is to do the journey of the hero, the other is to do the myth of contrast and conflict, and the third is to do Mircea Eliade's chaos of creation. That'll come later. Let's look at some stories that will illustrate this, because it's always good to have stories. Though I'm hesitant about telling a story and interrupting a story and commenting on it in the course of the storytelling. But I can talk about the gist of the story, and you can listen to the story, read the story. Perhaps you know the story from elsewhere. And that sort of keeps the integrity of the story together. and it keeps talk about storytelling separate. So I want to look at two myths. One is a myth of native peoples of North America, specifically what in America, in the United States, is called the Pacific Northwest, but also extending into British Columbia and Canada and up into the lower parts of Alaska. And these are the coastal people who live there, who share a very similar mythology all the way from Oregon all the way up to Alaska. And this particular story, the version that I tell, though there's so many versions to it, is from the Nootka people of Vancouver Island in Canada. I'm going to use this as an opening, and then I'm going to use a story from Central Asia from the Kazakh people called Unerbek, the Faithful Herdsman, as another way of looking at this chaos and creation. So why am I doing two stories? One is because the first story is obviously a creation myth, and it's too easy to say, oh, well, Eliade's classification of stories and myths only apply to when we're doing how come stories, stories that explain things, stories that explain why creation is the way it is, how it came into being, why creatures are the same, the way they are, etc., etc. And that's too narrow. It's really too narrow a definition. Because as a storyteller can move in their telling very powerfully from the confusion and the emptiness and the nothingness of chaos, which we experience in our lives and which cultures experience in their own transformations. Things fall apart. Things fall apart and things become chaotic. And you want to take something out of this chaos. You want to create something that comes from the chaos, that is not equal to the chaos, but is a new beginning that is new life. So it is a different way of working with stories. So the gist of the story from the Nootka people is this. It's about one of the main characters, who is Raven, who is the trickster in Native people's storytelling. Sometimes it's another animal, but in the Northwest, it tends towards being Raven. But remember from what I said before, that on the journey there's, and also from Ulrich's laws, there's also doubling of characters. So in this story, Raven is doubled by another winged creature who is Seagull, and they are sort of the two sides of this theme of chaos and creation. So you can see already we can use a story like this with Journey of the Hero, because it's the journey of the Raven or the Raven Seagull in order to get a gift and to bring it back. That's the journey of the hero. And they are doubles of each other. They're mirrors of each other. They're Hansel and Gretel. It's one character, but two forms. And it's also a question of contrast and conflict. Because, and this is also a very common theme in indigenous peoples of North America, and that is, the common theme is that of generosity versus stinginess. There's a wonderful collection by George Bird Grinnell, who's an anthropologist, a collector, a lover of the Old West. He did a lot of important work in collecting stories from the Plains Indians, and it's called Punishment of the Stingy. And it's a series of stories, beginning with stories of great stinginess and the disaster that leads to, all the way to the other side to stories of great generosity, the generosity leading to blessings and life. So we'll go back to the Nootka story. So the Nootka story is the story of it opens up like the book of Genesis, the days of creation, except that in this narrative, each of the first people who were here before human beings, the first people, are all given gifts, mountains and oceans and seedlings and everything that's the stuff of creation, except the last gift is given in Siegel, and it's light, light. And Siegel refuses to open the box. So, in the beginning, there was darkness. So, all the animal people cannot convince Siegel to open the box. There's a lot of material for spinning the story here as one after another. The animal people try this thing or another, flattery, threats, begging, and they finally say, well, it's not working. So they go to his cousin, Siegel's cousin, Raven. And Raven goes through the same process. So you see, it's a nice full story because you've got a lot of repetition, a lot of different characters, and a lot of different feelings. And it's why I love this story. And I particularly I love to tell the story to children or mixed audiences. And it's one of my oldest stories. I've been telling the story for almost 50 years. So finally, Raven is so upset with this frustration that he wishes, and he's Raven, he's a trickster, whatever he thinks happens. This is the god creates, the culture hero creates, and he wishes that Siegel had a thorn in his foot, in his claw. And it happens, and then we've got the next part of the story. And Siegel is crying out, my foot, it hurts, and Raven says, oh, I'll help. And what he does, and this is the drama of the story, and there's a repetition here, it happens a number of times. Every time he goes to help, he pushes it in further. And every time that happens, Siegel cries out and lets out a little more of the light from the box that it's in, the cedar box used by the peoples of the Northwest. Beautiful cedar boxes painted with the juices of berries and so forth. And he opens it and 3 times. The first time very little and all the stars come out. The second time a little more and the moon comes out. The third time when Raven pushes it really deep, he throws both wings up, the box lid tumbles off, and the sun comes out. And in the beginning there was light. And there are variations on the story. So many variations and so many different places to begin it and end it, and different events, that it's part of a very rich cultural tradition of the native peoples of the west coast of North America. So it is, of course, a journey, as our friend Joseph Campbell would say. Siegel is going on a journey. He's going to discover the gift. He finds the gift, and he brings it back. Not willingly in the story, but he brings it back. And it's a contrast myth. It's the stinginess of Siegel versus the generosity of everybody else. Everybody else is willing to share their gifts. And Raven picks up that theme. He is doing something that is very hurtful in order to achieve a greater good. And this is part of the dilemma of telling the story, because the audience will have issues around this. So you have to consider how to spin a story and how to deal with the questions that come up out of it about, in this case, poor old Siegel. They're beating up on him. Okay, so I mean that's another issue. It's not for today. So the story is also, and perhaps most critically, a creation myth. Other anthropologists and folklorists would put it in a category. They say tall tales, how come stories, hidden, all kinds of different categories for stories, but this would be in the story of creation. It's a creation myth. So you see, the struggle is between chaos and the gift of creation. And when you tell a story like this, when I tell a story like this, and I want to emphasize the creation myth aspect of it, I will emphasize the darkness and the chaos. There's no world. No one can see the world. The stuff of the world is there, But the one essential ingredient that unifies the world, that makes it visible, that makes it alive, makes light, makes things grow, makes it alive, is the sun. So it is a story of chaos and creation that reverberates through the story. So every time Siegel refuses to open the box with the other animal people, it emphasizes the shaky, tentative existence of being in this place where you're dependent on life and the life giver is not going to give it to you. It's repeated with ravens going through the same thing. And then, of course, it's repeated in the constant trickery of ravens, sticking the thorn in deeper and Siegel crying out even more with pain. See, pain is darkness, is chaos. When we live a chaotic world, or when our culture creates a chaotic world, when the world begins to crumble, and when we have chaos rather than an ordered world, there is pain. I mean, there is pain. When families disintegrate, there is pain. When you are taking your journey through life and you make a bad mistake and a wrong decision, and you suffer for it, and others do too, there is pain. So, this seemingly heavy handed or heavy clawed metaphor of sticking the thorn in the deeper is really a reflection of the whole metaphysic of the story. The confusion and pain and darkness and suffering and nihilism of chaos versus the joy of creation. So let me move to another story, because as I said, this story is very much a story which is a creation story. So, well, how can you can't do this with all stories? I mean, this is a specific kind of a theme. Well, it's not. So the other story I want to take is the story of Unerbek. And Unerbek is a lad in Kazakhstan in Central Asia, the majority people in the Republic of Kazakhstan, below Siberian wilderness and above the deserts of Central Asia, in Uzbekistan and the other republics of Central Asia. It's a great place for herding. And these are the grasslands that extend all the way from Mongolia all the way into the Ukraine and into Central Europe. So there's a lot of history, a lot of stories, a lot of swapping of stories between people. A lot of the Hungarian stories that I tell, because that's my ancestry, a lot of them are from the Turkish and Hunnish and even Mongolian peoples who shared that same grassland, the steppes, as it was called, as they migrated over thousands of years and influenced each other in their language and their customs and in their storytelling. So this is not a creation story, seemingly, but Eliade, because he writes so much about shamanism, this is a story about shamanism, and it is a creation story. So let me give you the gist first. Unerbek is a shepherd lad. They have one little goat. His mother's a widow. They live on the milk of the goat. And Unerbek, who is now approaching manhood, says, we can't live like this. The goat is only enough for you. I will go out and find my fortune. In the second scene, he wanders for a long, long time until he finally sees a yurt in the middle of the steppe. A yurt is a tent, a Turkish type of tent. And there's an old man there whose name is Turlan Bey. And he strikes up a bargain, and he will be a shepherd, a horse herd, actually, because Turlan Bey has a herd of horses. But if he loses any of the horses to ravaging wolves, Turlan Bey will take his life, Unerbek's life. That's set in the second scene. Third scene is that Unerbek is now keeping vigil through the night with the horses, and one of the horses speaks to him. That's Buzzarbek. We'll find out who he is later on. And says that Turlan Bey is a wicked magician and he will kill you, and this is what you must do in order to survive. So the following scene is that the wolf does come, and Unerbeck takes out his knife, and taking out his knife, he struggles, he overcomes the wicked old magician, and he threatens to kill him unless he reveals his powers and his secrets, because he can obviously turn himself into a wolf. So what else can he do? And he instructs him for the rest of the night until dawn comes, and then he says, "I can't do it in the light of day." And it's interesting, isn't it? It's, again, here's the polarity: light and dark, good and evil. So he can only teach his crafts, his dark arts, in the dark of the night. And so at that point, the next step is the most dramatic part of the story. I think it's the fifth episode, and that is that there's a chase that begins, and Turlan Bey constantly changes himself into another animal of prey in order to capture and destroy Unerbeck, who also has now the power to transform himself. So it's a long litany of transformations, and it can be expanded or shortened as it wishes. So the opening one is Unerbeck turns himself into a horse and begins to gallop away under threat of Turlan Bey. And Turlan Bey turns himself into a dragon, and he surrounds the horse with his huge body. And at that moment, as he's breathing fire and is about to kill the horse, Unerbeck, transforms himself into a tree. And it goes on, different fish, different birds, etc., until the final transformation happens when, at the last part of the story, and this gist of the story, when Unerbeck is a little sparrow and he's being pursued by a bird of prey, a hawk, and he sees another yurt. And he flies into the yurt, his flap is open, he flies in, he sees a beautiful young woman looking very sadly into a mirror. And at that moment, he transforms himself again, this time into seemingly an inanimate object of a beaded cap that falls on her head. And Turlan Bey turns himself into a young man, a very gifted musician. He comes in and he begins playing a song, singing for the woman, as was the custom in that culture. And then she, as was the custom, would say, "That was a beautiful piece you did. What would you like as a gift in exchange?" And you know what he says. You know what he wants. So I'm not going to tell you how it ends because you have to go to the story. But in the end, Turlan Bey is destroyed. And of course, Unerbeck marries the woman. The speaking horse is actually her brother, who was enchanted earlier. And he's been disenchanted. And Unerbeck now fetches his mother, who's been living in poverty. And they are all together, this new family, and they lived happily ever after. So it's a story. First of all, if you had to classify the story, it's the story of the shaman's journey. A shaman is, it's not quite right to say medicine man or witch doctor or anything like that. A shaman is a person who possesses psychological and spiritual insight, usually brought about by a crisis in life. And he needs to reinvent himself. He disintegrates. It might be a kind of a psychosis. More than just a neurosis. It's something very powerful. Then there are rituals for becoming shamans, of being tutored by an older shaman, and you take a journey into the underworld, like Joseph Campbell says, and you come back with the gift of healing. That's what the shaman does. So Unerbeck does this. So it is a shamanistic story, but it's also a creation story. So let's just go through this very briefly, and then I'm going to end with this. In the next video, we'll look at these three different kinds of metaphysical approaches to storytelling and summarize them and bring them back to some practical ways that you can use them as a teller of any kind of stories. So in the course of this journey that happens, you can see, of course, that Unerbeck is on a quest a journey like Joseph Campbell's hero. He gets his magical powers, he comes back, and he shares it with his community. The woman he marries, his mother, and others. That's one way. It's also, according to Levi Strauss, a conflict myth. The conflict between moral good and moral evil. The conflict between the two characters, the wicked shaman and the new good shaman, and a lot of other contrasts too. But as a creation myth, this is interesting. It starts off with chaos, and if you spin the story this way, this will be emphasized. The chaos is the utter hopelessness of Unnerbeck and his mother. They are poor. They are impoverished. They have one goat. This is a culture where herds determine your wealth. And there's no way out of it. There's no way out of it. The child has lost his father. The wife has lost her husband. They have no status in the community. They live on the edge of society. They are people who are totally marginal. So out of this chaos comes a creative act. And the creative act is, I will go out and find my fortune. I will resolve this dilemma. I will create something new. I will create a new life for me and for you, Mother. And he goes out. So then the theme is repeated again, because he finds that yurt with Turlan Bey with his little wispy beard and his devious ways, and the restless horses, because many of them are people who have been enchanted by Turlan Bey. And so there's another chaotic situation that comes in. He finds himself now employed by a wicked employer. And he is enslaved. I mean, he's like, Joseph in Egypt and people of Israel. They're enslaved. And the price that he will pay will be death if he fails in the next task, which is resisting the wolf. So he does, of course. And here again, we have another kind of chaos to creation. Because in this chaotic, dark time, with night approaching and entering into the darkness of night, the dumb animals suddenly speak. One of the horses speaks. And this is a phenomenon that's in all kinds of mythologies. This is the beginning of a new creation. In Christian nativity spirituality, it is the horses in the manger on Christmas Eve who speak, because history is about to change in the worldview of Christians. With the birth of the Christ child, something new has happened, and the bonds of slavery and entrapment have been broken. And on that evening, the animals speak. And it's been picked up in folklore. There are a lot of folk tales from Eastern Europe about speaking animals on Christmas Eve. So this happens. And again, we have a glimmer of creation, and he's given instructions on what he needs to do. And then we get back into chaos. Everything falls apart. There he is. He's done his training. He's done his apprenticeship. He's learned what he needs to do in order to be successful and survive. And the wolf comes out, and he's got to struggle with the wolf. And he can't kill the wolf, but he can extract the wisdom of the wolf, or the knowledge, and use it for better purposes, use it for wisdom. So in that process of learning through the night, the same thing happens. He moves from being unskilled, having no ability to survive in the world, just as no child or no juvenile can survive in the world on their own, until they build a repertoire of skills. And that's what growing up is about. It's not just physical, it's psychological and spiritual skills that need to be nourished. So he does all of that. And then just to emphasize the point, see, remember threefold repetition from Axel Ulrich? The whole scene's going to be repeated again. Because now we're going to see how well he has learned his skills, and what the Dark Master will do to hinder him. And so we have a number of transformations. And all of these stories, there's a Welsh tale about Taliesin and how he transforms himself by tasting the liquid in the cauldron. Well, it's another story. But there's always a series of transformations. And in the end, he is successful and the chaos is destroyed. Unnerbeck lives and Buzzerbeck lives, and Turlan Bey dies in his last form, which is an interesting form that he takes before he is destroyed. And so we have chaos creation, chaos creation, chaos creation again and again and again. And that is why this is a creation myth. I'm going to stop. One last video in this series, this opening series of these videos that I'm recording, to look at those three categories of the metaphysics of storytelling. I'm Bob Wilhelm. I'm a teacher, and then I'm a storyteller. See you next time.